Army Air Force. It later became the Air Force. It was the Army Air Force in 1943 when I enlisted.
In what war were you?
World War II.
What was your rank?
When I went in, I was a private. When I came out, I was a first lieutenant.
And where did you serve?
I served, my overseas service was in Great Britain, flying over Germany and the continent.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I joined an enlisted reserve program when I was in college
Where were you living at the time?
in Princeton, New Jersey.
Why did you join?
Because they gave us an opportunity, they said, to be deferred until the end of the war. This didn't happen somehow. In fact, I was enlisted in December of 1942, and we were called to active duty in February of 43, 2 months later.
Why did you pick the branch that you joined?
Because I wanted to fly.
Do you recall your first days in the service?
Certainly, very simple. We all got together in Trenton, New Jersey at the post office. We were told we didn't know where we were going, although we had told everybody that we were going to Atlantic City, New Jersey for basic training. Then they put us on a train and took us to Atlantic City, New Jersey.
What did it feel like during the first days?
A little bit different from civilian life. We were, every minute was pretty much spoken for. We were either drilling or in training sessions or classrooms. So it was the basic training, or was fairly basic, as they said. They were trying to teach us, first of all, how to march, how to respond to commands, and just basic military discipline.
Do you remember anything else about your boot camp experience?
Well, actually in the Air Force we called what you call boot camp, we called basic training. And that was on a lot of it was on the boardwalk at Atlantic City, or at an infamous field known as Brigantine Field, where we would go to drill, or we used to go into the Atlantic City Convention Hall for mass exercises or mass training of one sort or another. We were quartered in what in civilian life had been hotels on the boardwalk.
So was that comfortable to live in?
It was adequate. It was not luxurious. For example, we'd have the first night we were there, we had 150 people sleeping in the ballroom, and unfortunately there was a situation where food had disagreed with some, and there was only one working toilet for 150 men.
Do you remember your instructors during basic training?
Yes, in basic training, yes, they were. We had such interesting ranks as acting corporal. These were people who had been temporarily promoted from private to acting corporal so that they could be our drill instructors. They were pretty rough and ready, and rather profane in their language.
What did you do to get through basic training?
What did we do to get through it? We merely were there and learned to drill and march, and learned certain rules of basic military behavior. We learned how to what uniforms to wear and when to wear them. We were normally instructed on what uniforms we were to wear, be it fatigues or what they called Class A's, which were a blouse and trousers.
How long was basic training?
4 weeks.
Where did you go when that was finished?
To what they called College Training Detachment, and they sent the group I was in was sent to Penn State University at State College, Pennsylvania. And they geared the length of time that you were sent to so-called college training detachment to how much education you had had before. High school graduates were normally sent for probably 2 to 3 months of college training. I, as having had some college beforehand, was there for only 6 weeks.
What did you do while you were there?
Training, courses, and further drill, of course.
And after that, where did you go?
Well, from college training detachment, we went to what they called a classification center. And the classification center was at Nashville, Tennessee. And there we were there for about 4 to 6 weeks, although the actual the time that they spent testing us was only about 2 or 3 days. However, there we were given tests to find our aptitudes for either pilot, navigator, or bombardier.
Do you remember what the tests were like?
They were some of them were mental tests, some of them were physical coordination tests. I do remember them.
And what was your job from those tests?
Job from the tests, I classified initially as my highest rating was for navigator, but there was a big demand for pilots, and I was high enough in the pilot level so that I was set to pilot training.
Where was that?
Well, I started out in pre-flight training at Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama. That was July and August in Alabama, and you can imagine the weather at that point. It was very hot, and there was no such thing as air conditioning. However, and we double timed everywhere. We ran instead of walking. So it was fairly rigorous. That was 2 months of that. And then I went from there to primary flight training at Union City, Tennessee. And unfortunately, I washed out of pilot training in my last week of primary school. So very fortunately, since I had qualified for navigation, I then went off to start navigation school.
What does that mean, wash out?
It means you were eliminated, you were busted.
So where was navigation school?
Navigation school was at Selman Field, Monroe, Louisiana. S-E-L-M-A-N.
What was that like?
That was also was interesting. We had the first half of the school was what they call piloted. Oh, we had meteorology along the way too, both at pre-flight at Maxwell and later in navigation school. We had a course in meteorology. We had various types of navigation, what they call pilotage, which is where you look at the ground and you identify features on the ground. However, that doesn't work very well when you've got 100% cloud coverage down below. And so we had dead reckoning, which is using your compass and your time. And then were other methods too. The second half of the navigation school, which, as I remember, it was something like 24 weeks. Yeah, just about 20. It was 20 weeks. The last half of it was entirely on celestial navigation, using the stars, shooting the stars through an octant to determine your position, or shooting what they called sun lines.
What would have happened if you had not tested for navigation once you were washed out of pilot training?
I probably would have become an aerial gunner, and that would have been sent to gunnery school.
After navigation training, where did you go?
Well, navigation training, I will, obviously, in between times, occasionally we had a week's leave or something of that sort. So, but after, essentially the next stage after completing navigation school was to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, where I joined up with the other members of my crew. And from Lincoln, Nebraska, we went to Alexandria, Louisiana, where we learned to fly as a crew on a B-17.
What does a crew consist of?
Well, in the early days of World War II, it consisted of 10 men, then it was cut down to 9 men. You had pilot and co-pilot. Then you had navigator and bombardier. These were all officers. Then the enlisted men were the flight engineer slash top turret gunner. He did both things. We had a radio operator. We had a ball turret gunner. And initially they had 2 waist gunners. Then they cut that down to 1 later on. And then they had a tail gunner. So we started out with crews of 10, and then it cut it down to 9.
Did you stay with the same crew during your whole tour?
During my entire combat period, yes, I was with the same crew. On one mission, I flew with another crew instead of my own crew because their own navigator was ill. So I got 1 mission ahead of my crew. Consequently, I flew my last mission one mission ahead of them. So I finished my 35 on 1 mission before they did. But otherwise, I flew with the same crew throughout.
When did you first leave the United States?
In August of 1944.
Where did you go?
Well, we picked up a brand new airplane in Kearney, Nebraska. From Kearney, Nebraska, we flew to Manchester, New Hampshire. And from Manchester, New Hampshire, we flew to Gander, Newfoundland. And from Gander, Newfoundland, we were weathered in there for a couple of days. And from Gander, Newfoundland, we flew across the Atlantic to Valley, Wales, which is on the island of Anglesey, part of Wales.
And what did it feel like during the trip over?
Well, it was not too different from a number of our training flights, although it was longer. It was 11.5 hours from Gander to Valley, Wales. And at one point of the flight, I was the only person aboard who was awake. Everybody else was sound asleep. They had it flying on the autopilot. And I discovered in trying to reach people on the interphone that everybody was sound asleep. But this was okay because the airplane was, and I, as navigator, I had my hands full working and keeping track of our position.
How soon after landing in Wales,
Yes.
did you see combat?
How soon after that? We landed this was mid-August. We didn't see any combat till September.
What did you do until then?
Well, we've initially from Wales, we were initially sent to a training school outside of London in a place called Bovingdon. And in Bovingdon, the school was supposed to last for 9 days, but the demand for crews was such that they shortened that and set us to our respective air bases before the 9 days was up. So we were turned loose. The school in Bovingdon was to teach us certain procedures and methods of operation that were peculiar to the European theater and flying out of the United Kingdom. Particularly some local navigation methods.
Did they differ very much from what you had learned?
There was one particular technique that the British turned over to the Americans and we used over there, and it was not used in any other theater of operations. It was called the GEE. This was a forerunner of LORAN, and we had a large electronic box from which we could locate ourselves when we were over the British Isles and over the North Sea to within yards. but after we got over the continent, the Germans jammed this particular operation, so we couldn't use it over the continent.
What other equipment did you use to navigate there?
Oh, we used what they called a flux gate compass, which was an electronic compass. We had the G-box, which I've described. We had an airspeed indicator. We had what they called a drift meter, which if you could see the ground, you could look through this drift meter at the ground and see what your course was compared to what your compass heading was. So in other words, from this, you could then compute what the wind was. We had the drift meter, as I said, the airspeed indicator, and we, of course, had an altimeter, which gave you your altitude.
You said you were on a B-17?
B-17, otherwise known as the Flying Fortress, built by Boeing. It was obsolete, or we considered it obsolete because they had already come out with the B-29, and there were a number of differences between these because on the B-17 it was not pressurized at all, and it was not heated to any degree, and it got to be 55 degrees below zero up at altitude. So we wore, in the B-17, we wore electrically heated suits, and we had to be on oxygen from over 10,000 feet when we climbed up past 10,000, and we also were connected to the airplane with an interphone cord. So we had three umbilicals really to the airplane: the oxygen, the electric connection for your heated suit, and the interphone. So it didn't make getting around very easy. If you had to go to another part of the airplane, you disconnected your oxygen hose and connected it to what they call a walk-around bottle, which was just a portable oxygen container so that you could breathe.
How much room was there in the plane to walk around?
Well, the plane was probably 80 feet long, 70 or 80 feet long, and from nose to tail, I mean, what we had to do, the bombardier and I were both in the nose of the airplane. To get to the rest of the airplane, we had to climb up into the flight deck and go from the flight deck through the bomb bay, and from the bomb bay into the radio room, and then from the radio room into what they call the waist, getting around the ball turret, which was low, and then you got back to where the waist gunners were, and then went further back, and you got to the tail. So there was room to get around a bit.
What exactly does waist gunner mean?
Waist gunner, the portion of the airplane which is in the fuselage in front of the tail and back of the wings. That whole long portion of the airplane body or fuselage is called the waist. And there were 50 caliber machine guns in each side of that. So a waist gunner would be operating one of those machine guns in that portion of the airplane.
What about the bombardier? What was his specific job?
The bombardier sat right smack in the most forward part of the nose, and there was a large plexiglass window through which he used his bomb sight. If he had a bomb sight, he would use that up there, and he had a small instrument panel at his left side from which he controlled the bomb bay doors and was able to release the bombs.
How exact were you able to drop bombs on your target?
How exact? It varied a great deal depending on weather circumstances. If we had what we called 10/10ths coverage, or entire cloud coverage of the ground below, we would do what they called toggle. In other words, drop our bombs manually using a switch based on when the lead ship dropped. Now, the lead ships had radar, and they had a large radar antenna sticking out underneath the fuselage from where the ball turret would be on the other airplanes. So instead of a ball turret, the lead ship had a radar antenna. The nickname for that was Mickey, or PFF, pathfinding.
was
The lead bombardier would be using the so-called Mickey operator, and the lead bombardier worked together. Actually, the Mickey operator would be able to see through the clouds using the radar, and would fix on the target when. And the rest of us dropped our bombs when the lead ship did. Now, when there were visual conditions, we had a thing called a Norden bomb sight, which was very, very secret at the first part of the war. In fact, you had to be a commissioned officer to handle one, and normally in the initial phases, you were supposed to carry a sidearm or a gun if you were a pistol, I should say. If you were carrying one of these things around. The bomb sight was removable from the airplane, and interestingly enough, the bomb sight was made by an outfit called Norden on Long Island, and it was a means by which, once they got it all set up, the bombardier, not the pilot, would be guiding the plane using the bomb sight. That was the bomb sight was tied in with the autopilot at that point, so he actually steered the plane. Now, probably to be easier if I explain the fact that when we got on our bomb run, we would first go to what they called the initial point, or IP, which was a point distant from the target itself, about a 10 minutes or 9 or 10 minutes flying time from the target. But from the IP, the initial point, to the target, the bombardier would be controlling the airplane, and the airplane would be flying straight and level, which made it a very easy target for the anti-aircraft gunners. We could do no evasive action while we were on the bomb run. And that was usually a 9 or 10 minute run.
It seems like a big window of time to be open like that.
It felt like 30 minutes, believe me.
How often did you do that?
How often did we do that? We did it for every mission, all 35 missions.
What was a typical mission like?
Well, we had a wide variety of missions. We had long mission, what they call deep penetration, or less penetration. Now, a deep penetration would be 10 to 10 and a half hours in the air, of which about half the time you would be at altitudes requiring oxygen, meaning that you were on oxygen for about half of that mission, which was quite fatiguing. You would take off, and you would, from takeoff, you would be, at briefing, you would have been given an assembly point, and we would fly to the assembly point and climb on the way to the assembly point. And then, usually above the clouds, you would get in formation at that point. And from there, you would head, you would have been given a course to follow at your briefing. Pilots and navigators would have we would have a general briefing in the morning before we went off on a mission, and we'd have a meeting, the pilots, navigators, and bombardiers together, and then we would have separate briefings for the navigators and for the bombardiers, in which case we were all given our special instructions. So we would fly across the enemy coast at a given point. We would still be climbing. Usually we would cross the enemy battle lines at about 25,000 feet, which is 5 miles up. And we would have been on oxygen since 10,000 feet. So, of course, when you had a bomb load, you could climb much more slowly than you could without the bomb load. And we would not fly in a straight line. We would be on a zigzag somewhat, so that the enemy, in trying to determine what we were going to do, would not be able to know right away what we were up to. We would be as part of a stream for the Air Force. I mean, there would be many groups going to bomb the same target. So we would be maybe 3 minutes behind another bomb group ahead of us, unless we were leading.
You flew in formation. How many planes is in one formation?
In one formation, you'd have anywhere from 13 to 36, depending on what kind of a formation you were flying. If you're flying in what they called group formation, the whole group, you might have 36. A high squadron of 12 or 13, a lead squadron of another 12 or 13, and the low squadron. These would be 500 feet apart, altitude-wise. No, not 500, less than that, 1,000 feet.
And how close were you to the plane next to you in your formation?
Too close. We were flying formation. We would be where some parts were maybe 20, 30 feet.
Did planes ever collide?
Yes. If they collided, usually they would crash.
Can you describe one of your more memorable missions?
Yes. On Christmas Eve of 1944, we were assigned to go to Darmstadt in Germany. And on the way in, we got hit by anti-aircraft fire, which sort of knocked out one of the left engines. So we tried to feather that, and as I remember it, we weren't able to feather it. By feathering it means you turn the propeller so that it is perpendicular to the airstream so that it is not blown around like a windmill. I'm not sure that he was able to feather that, and we were not, with 3 engines, we decided we weren't going to go to the target with everybody else because we would not be able to fly as fast as they did. So we then dropped our bombs on, quote, a target of opportunity, which is something that you try to pick out on the ground where the bombs won't be wasted. In other words, something that would be of military significance to eliminate. So we dropped on a target of opportunity and turned back towards, to come back to England. And as we approached the French coast, number 1 engine quit. So we had 2 engines out on the same side, one windmilling and the other one feathered. But flying a B-17 on just 2 engines on one side is very difficult, and you cannot maintain altitude. So we started throwing out everything we could move. Guns, ammunition, anything of any weight at all went out the hatch, was jettisoned. And on that particular mission, we finally were able to get to an emergency field just barely in England, a place called Manston, M-A-N-S-T-O-N, which was near, not too far from Dover, which, as you know, is right across the channel from France, so the narrowest point of the channel. And we landed at Manston, which had a very, very long runway, which we needed because our hydraulics were completely gone because they were driven by one of the left engines, and so that we needed a lot of runway to land on. This was Christmas Eve, and we wound up spending Christmas Day with the RAF, who were very good hosts.
When you say a target of opportunity, who decides what that would be?
The bombardier and the navigator discuss it between themselves. Well, unless, yeah, it's what you can see. Or if you don't, if you've got complete cloud coverage, you just go ahead and drop.
How far into your 35 missions were you during that?
Well, that was on the Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, and I finished my missions the last day of February, so that was probably, my 16th or 17th mission. Another very difficult mission, of course, was when my bombardier was killed. And that was on the 17th of January of 1945, and that was on a mission to Hamburg, Germany. And he was killed while we were on the bomb run.
Your plane got shot at?
Our plane got shot at constantly. We were like a clay pigeon with people with shotguns. The Germans were shooting at us all the time. And they were hitting a lot of people. They were killing a lot of people. We had a very high loss rate. On our very second mission, we had a direct hit from an 88 millimeter shell, which hit our right wing, and we suffered severe battle damage is what we called it. It knocked out part of the secondary spar. It hit a corner of one of our so-called Tokyo tanks, which was an extended range tank. And it also took out our aileron down control, so we had some problem controlling the plane. That was on our very second mission when we went to a place called Ludwigshafen in Germany.
Did you fly the same plane in all your missions?
Well, that's an interesting point. We flew a lot of different planes initially. Finally, when we were, probably 14, 15 missions, we wound up getting the same plane every time. Our plane's name was Ida-Wana.
How did it get that name?
The previous crew named it that. And a guy by the pilot who had it before we had it asked his crew to name it, and I think the radio operator says, well, I don't want to name it, but I don't want to be shot down. And the navigator promptly said, there's the name, Ida-Wana. Idawanna. And we flew that for the most part until the end of our missions. And that plane was later shot down.
It was during World War II?
Of course. They didn't fly them after World War II.
Were you a prisoner of war?
I was not.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
There was a standard award that we got for flying our missions, and our entire crew got the same awards. It was called the Air Medal, and I got the Air Medal with what they call 5 oak leaf clusters, which means that it was awarded 6 times altogether. The oak leaf cluster was just a re-awarding of the Air Medal, but you got that just for flying the missions. Earlier in the operation, they also had the Distinguished Flying Cross, which they awarded to everybody who completed 30 missions. But by the time we came along, they had discontinued that, so our crew did not wind up with Distinguished Flying Crosses.
How much time was in between missions?
Well, you could fly 2 missions in 2 days upon occasion, overnight. But sometimes it depended on a great many factors: the weather, and the demands of what was going on the continent. We flew submissions in support of the Battle of the Bulge.
What did you do on the ground in between missions?
Well, we would eat, sleep, go to the officers' club and have a drink, go to the officers' club, read magazines, tidy up your stuff in your hut. We lived in Quonset, what we call Quonset huts in the United States. They call them Nissen huts over there, and it's made out of galvanized iron, and it's a semicircular cross section with a flat end, fairly basic. Just hang out, you know. Or we would fly practice missions. We flew an awful lot of practice missions. Practice missions were where you flew up, down, and sideways over the British Isles for the most part. That would be we would not fly over Ireland per se, not the Free State. We would fly over Northern Ireland. The Free State was the Free State of Ireland was neutral, supposedly, in World War II, so we did not fly over that. But we would fly over Northern Ireland, or Scotland, or Wales, or England, or the North Sea.
Were you ever injured?
I was never wounded.
What did you do to pass the time on long flights in the air?
My job, primarily, because the navigator's job was to keep observing instruments. I had to keep track of where we were all the time, and I would read instruments and make an instrument recording and a position report every 15 minutes. So I was busy, and the bombardier was taking observations as much as he could. Pilots were obviously busy doing what they do, and the gunners were all supposed to keep observing. It was not a matter of just sitting on your duff and not doing anything. You had a job to do, and you did it. Things relaxed a great deal when on your way out, when you had completed a mission and you flew into friendly territory. The tension was eased off then. Incidentally, in my case, since I'd had flight training before, I used to go and I used to fly the airplane for 15 or 20 minutes or that length of time at a stretch to relieve the pilots. Since flying a B-17 is like driving a truck, but flying in formation is quite wearing, quite physically taxing, and particularly when you're in as close quarters as you are with the other airplanes, because you are constantly watching the other guys and avoiding them and trying to maintain a steady altitude and airspeed.
Are you able to fly on autopilot in formation?
No, strictly not. The lead ship could be on autopilot, yes, but not the guys that are maintaining formation with him.
Was your crew ever the lead?
We flew squadron leads, but not group leads.
How did it feel to get back on the ground after a mission?
Great relief. Great relief. In fact, after my 35th, I kissed the ground.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
They had mail, strictly mail, no telephone. We didn't have, of course, we didn't have the internet in those days, no emails, but we had something called V-mail. And the V-mail was something which you wrote the letter on a form, and it went to the post office, and they would photograph it. And I don't know whether it was sent by wire or what, but it was sent, I think, microfilm. Actually, what they did was a microfilm, and they'd send the microfilms across, and when they got across, they would then expand each frame of the microfilm into onto a form which was sent to the recipient.
What was the food like?
It varied. The food for flight crews was supposed to be better than the food for other people. We had one situation where it turned out that our mess officer was selling some of our food to some of the English country people around. So they finally nailed him, and after they caught up with him, the food improved. But things like fresh eggs were in very short supply. We'd get powdered eggs, and there was a sort of a standing joke that your cook was grinding up ping pong balls into the powdered eggs to make you think they were real. The food, by and large, was not too bad. It was not exceptionally good. It was adequate.
How was the living conditions in the Nissen huts?
The living conditions in the Nissen huts were basic, very basic. We made up our own bunks, or made beds. We had, in the officers' crew, in the officers' quarters, we had 12 men to a hut. In the enlisted men's, they had the same huts, but they had double-deck bunks, so they had probably 24 men in a hut. But we had one very small stove in the middle of this thing, which was extremely difficult to keep lighted overnight, and it really didn't do much more than take the chill off. And we also had rats. So when you ask how the living conditions were, not very good. We had sheets and blankets on our beds, and that was about all you could say for it. And our Washing facilities and toilet facilities were in separate huts. They were not in the same huts that we had. There were separate latrine areas and shower areas in different in a separate building hut. They were all Nissen huts.
Did you have plenty of supplies?
No, we were not short of supplies. No. The big problem was fuel for our stove, keeping our stove lighted and keeping it warm. So at night, occasionally, we'd go out on moonlight requisition expeditions around the area to find anything that would burn. Scrounging, you might call it.
I read in the book you gave me that some people bought bicycles. Did you have a bicycle?
I had a bicycle.
And what did you use it for?
I used to use the bicycle to go to the mess hall or go to the flight line, and ride back to the barracks. So it was probably a mile or a little less, but they were dispersed. They were separated in case the Germans came to bomb us.
Where did you get your bicycle?
A traveling peddler came around selling second-hand bicycles.
How close were you living to civilian towns?
To civilian towns, well, the closest town to our base, which was called Deefham Green, was the town of Attleboro. Attleboro, Attleborough, Attleboro. Attleboro was probably a mile and a half, and then there was another very small town called Hingham, Hingham, which was not too far from our base, but these were a mile or so. What we were on, our base had been was made from what had been farmers' fields, and there were some of the farmers' buildings still on the base, and there were some farmers living on the base in their buildings.
Were you able to go into town at all?
To go into town? Yeah, we could go into town from time to time. We could go to pubs. We would get a leave every now and then, a 48-hour leave or 3-day pass, as it was said, and we'd go to London. No, we'd get on the train in Attleboro. We'd have to take the train from Attleboro to Cambridge and change in Cambridge and then go to London. So, but it was only about 2 hours from London. So we would go in and hoop it up. Different strokes for different folks, you know.
We'll leave it at that.
Well, I was engaged to a young lady in the United States at the time, so I didn't get mixed up with any of the English ladies, but some of the guys got mixed up with some of the English ladies.
Did you feel any pressure or stress from the war every day?
I think everybody did. Everybody would have much rather been a civilian at that time. But we all recognized the fact that it was a job that had to be done and somebody had to do it, so there we were. I much preferred to being in the Air Force than I would have been on the ground. Number one, we were in a great deal of danger when we were over enemy territory, yes. We were in danger of being shot down, killed. However, this would be for several hours at the most. After that, we would have a place to sleep and at least 2 meals a day, the square meals, whereas the ground troops didn't have a place to sleep and their meals were haphazard. So, I mean, and their periods of danger were 24 hours a day.
Was there anything special you did for good luck?
For good luck? Oh, a lot of us probably carried some kind of a talisman or a good luck thing or whatever, or a pair of socks or something like that. A lot of people did a lot of different things. I very frankly don't remember what I did. if anything. I knew one guy who always wore the same red sweater with his uniform, but it was with flight clothes, so it didn't show. But he always wore his good luck red sweater.
You said you were engaged to a girl at home. Did you write to her often?
I wrote to her quite frequently. I did not marry her later. We broke up after I got back, but that's all right. I didn't get married till long after the war. I got married in 1958, 13 years after the war. I was an old guy.
How did you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife? I met her in, this was an arranged meeting, interestingly enough. Some people who knew both of us thought we should meet and arranged to have us meet, and got hold of, my wife's name is Wendy, with an E on the end, not a Y. And she was visiting her family from San Francisco when we were introduced. So she was working in San Francisco, I was working in Buffalo, New York at the time, and she came to visit her family in Buffalo, and we were introduced, and things gradually took off. We weren't married for 4 years after that, but it was a whirlwind 4-year courtship.
How did people entertain themselves in their free time during the war?
How did they entertain themselves? Oh my Lord. How do civilians entertain themselves? People would read, people would, they'd hike, they'd ride a bike in the countryside. They'd a whole wide variety of occupations. I mean, you can't just say that everybody did the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. Some of them had girlfriends in the area, and they would visit their girlfriends if they were able to get off the base. That took a little wangling every now and then. But no, you couldn't generalize.
What are a few of your favorite pastimes?
What are my favorite pastimes? I think I did a lot of reading. A lot of reading, a lot of writing. Oh, we would go to the movies. They have movies on the base. In the evenings, we would probably socialize at the officers' club. And the enlisted men had what they called the Aero Club, where they went. So I mean, it was not limited to the fact that the officers could go to. There were places for everybody. And there, at the officers' club, there were magazines and books and you name it. Frequently, there were a place to have coffee, you know.
Did you see any entertainers or USO shows?
Yes, we had a few shows that came to our base. I don't remember any particular headliners, no Bob Hopes or anybody of that sort. Bob Hope did a lot of entertaining in World War II, but he never came to our base. But we had girl singers and dancers and what have you.
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events that happened?
Depends on what you call humorous. We had some not really humorous. We had some I can remember one particular mission when we were taking off, and the pilot and co-pilot came to the conclusion that halfway down the runway with a load of bombs, we had our controls still locked, so they had to release those in a great hurry so we could get off the ground. Otherwise, it would have been a very unhappy situation at the end of the runway. They did get the controls unlocked, and we did take off. There was another interesting time when we were flying back to we were in friendly territory, and we were running very low on gas, and we decided we wanted to land in Belgium to gas up. And we wound up talking to one airfield, a place called Lyon, L-A-O-N, and there were two airfields at Lyon. One was for bombers or for bigger airplanes, and one was for fighters. And we wound up talking to on the radio to the one with the big runway, but we wound up landing on the one for fighters. Because, I mean, there were these two airports were right close by each other. So we had to be refueled by hand out of jerry cans in order to get enough to fly back to England. And this took about 3 or 4 hours using jerry cans to refuel the B-17. They didn't fuel us up fully, but the B-17 would hold, full fuel load was 2,780 gallons, 2,780 gallons of gas. So they probably loaded us up with half of that using jerry cans. So you can imagine how long that took. Had we landed at the airport where we were supposed to and were talking to, they would have done it with a fuel truck.
Did anyone ever pull pranks on each other?
Oh, constantly. Oh, yeah, this is the name of the game. One of the things we used to do, if somebody fell asleep, I think I mentioned the small stoves that we had, and the stoves were, you would wind up, because they threw so little heat, you'd wind up in a circle of chairs sitting around this thing. And your front would be heating up and your back would be freezing. And every now and then people would fall asleep in this situation. And there were two things. You'd give one of them a hot foot, and you may be familiar with that, but a hot foot was getting their shoe and putting 2 matches head in under the sole of the shoe and then lighting those up, and then when it flares up it gives you quite a hot sensation. Or another thing would be to take a can of lighter fluid and put it on the floor all the way around them, put a circle of lighter fluid. As these people are asleep, you see, and then you light the whole thing and you tap them on the shoulder and they're surrounded by fire. Fun and games, you know.
Did you make any close friends in your crew or with the other men?
The whole crew got to be pretty much like a brotherhood, very close to one another. There was no fooling around. Everybody called everybody else by their first name, regardless of rank. I mean, the tail gunner would call the pilot Joe, for example. I mean, you couldn't stand on military ceremony in this kind of a situation when you're flying an airplane as a crew. So this was a very informal, and as I said, we got to be very good friends with everybody on the crew. It was pretty much, it was not difficult to do, but it was quite easy. But I was convinced that our crew was the best going, and we were very lucky. The fact that I think I told you about the mission coming back Christmas Eve when we came back on 2 engines out of 4. That required great skill on the part of the pilot and co-pilot. They did a great job, and I was very close until he died. I was very close to the pilot. In fact, this is probably 15 years ago. We got early Christmas cards from my pilot's wife, which told me that he had terminal cancer. And before Christmas, I got on an airplane. I flew out and spent a day with him. In Indianapolis. And he died before Super Bowl Sunday. So he didn't last very long. Wonderful man. He was from a small town in Indiana. Talked like a hick. I mean, but he'd had a college education, but he still talked like a hick. And he wound up in civilian life. He flew after the war. He flew for a small airline out in the Midwest, and I think it was mostly cargo. But then he wound up teaching in vocational school. He was very good with his hands. He was extremely good. And before he took pilot training, he had been a crew chief on an airplane. And a crew chief is one who is in charge of maintenance. So he knew the airplane inside and out. And he was not a crew chief on a B-17, but on a trainer. But still the fact that he had these mechanical aptitudes, and he really knew within an ounce of what that airplane would take. Co-pilot was a little different. Co-pilot was, had gone through single engine training and was a frustrated fighter pilot, let's put it that way. The fact that he was flying a 4-engine plane instead of a fighter, I think, was a little bit frustrating to him, and he always was convinced that he could do a better job, perhaps, than our pilot. And so this, I'm sure, was a source of frustration to him. So, but he blended in with the crew all right. I'm still, well, there are only, to the best of my knowledge, there are either 3 or 4 of us still alive. Now, one guy I'm missing at the moment, who may be dead, I don't know. I've been trying to track him down, but 2 others that I know of are still alive. The ball turret gunner and the waist gunner. Ball turret gunner is you'd appreciate the fact he's of Italian extraction. He lives in Beverly, Massachusetts, and the waist gunner lives in a place that he insists is called Piles Grove, New Jersey. It's I call it Woodstown, but the post office box is Piles Grove. Whatever. But he is, as far as I know, is still alive, and I know that the ball turret gunner is still alive, and he is a wonderful man, and he lives, as I said, in Beverly, Mass. So I'm in touch with 3 out of the 4th guy I've lost touch with, and I'm trying to track him down now, out in Michigan.
You lived in New Jersey when you enlisted. How did you end up in Connecticut?
Oh, that's a long, sort of involved story. You may have picked up the fact in my vital statistics that I was born in Shanghai, China. My father was a professor of chemistry at a university in Shanghai, and when I went in the service, he had gone back to China, and unfortunately at that time was in Japanese hands. They had been taken over the foreign part of Shanghai, but my mother had lived in New Jersey when he left to go back to China. And then when he came back, he was repatriated from China in December of 1943, in the middle of the war, in an exchange between the Japanese and the Allies. He was in an internment camp in Shanghai for some months, but was exchanged they had a ship that went from Shanghai, a Japanese ship went from Shanghai to Lourenço Marques, which was then in Portuguese West Africa. And in Lourenço Marques, they met the Swedish ship Gripsholm, and the 2 groups were exchanged there. And my father came back to the United States from West Africa on the Gripsholm and I was given compassionate leave to come from Louisiana to New York to see him get off the boat, which was great. And however, he was repatriated in he got back in December of 43, and as soon as he got his health back, he wanted to get back to teaching. Now, he was offered 2 visiting professorships. One visiting professorship was at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, which I thought he really should have taken, since it was all girls, and I thought that was a great idea. But he took one at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Consequently, my family moved to Williamstown, Massachusetts then. Now, what brought me to Connecticut was I worked at a variety of places. I won't give you the whole list of towns, because I've lived in New York, I've lived in Chicago, I've lived in Reading, Pennsylvania, I've lived in Philadelphia, and I wound up applying for a job after I had left a previous one. Applying for a job, I saw an ad in the New York Times for Pratt & Whitney, and Pratt & Whitney was what brought me to Connecticut. And I worked for Pratt for 26 years.
Where were you when the European War was over?
When the European War was over? Let's see, that was June 1945, wasn't it? I had just gotten out. I was a civilian. I had enough points and so forth that I was able to, quite surprisingly, when I got back from overseas, I had a 30-day leave when I got back from overseas, and I was fully expecting to be sent to training for the B-29s and then going to the Pacific as a navigator. But when I was in my, after the 30-day leave, returning from overseas, I was in Atlantic City where they were, again, when they were processing us, and about the second or third day there, the interrogating officer said, "Well, Lieutenant, do you want to stay in or get out?" We had not heard a thing about it before, so it came as a total surprise. I said, "Sir, I'll have to think about that for a day or two." So the next day I told him I wanted to get out. And by VE Day, I was a civilian. I got out in May of 1945. VE came in June.
What did you do after you were discharged?
Well, after I was, when I was separated, I wasn't separated because I decided to go in the reserve, but anyhow, I first went back to see about going back to college. I had been a sophomore in college when I'd gone into the, enlisted in the reserve and been called to active duty. So, you're a sophomore, aren't you? I went back to college and signed up to go back in the fall. This was then in June. And I got a job locally in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and worked through the summer and then went back to college.
Where were you going to college?
Princeton University.
That's cool.
Fairly good.
Was your education supported by the GI Bill?
It was after World War II, yes.
What did you go to school for?
Well, I started out in engineering and I wound up backsliding and I wound up majoring in political science, or as they call it at Princeton, politics.
And what did you do at Pratt & Whitney?
I sold spare parts for jet engines to the engine overhaul shops and to airlines.
For 26 years?
For 26 years.
And when did you retire?
I retired in 1992.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
No, I was had what I considered a very fortunate war. Outside of the fact that my bombardier was killed, I had the impact that the war had on me was not terribly heavy. I trust it matured me some over the 2 years that 2 years plus that I was in. I was only in for 27 months altogether, beginning to end. And because that was compared to some people who were in 5 and 6 years, as you probably know. I was very lucky that way, so I don't feel that I was very strongly impacted by it. I was very fortunate in getting the GI Bill to help with my education, and that's about the extent of it, I think.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
I did not.
Have you attended any reunions?
I've been to, I think, one reunion many years ago in Boston, reunions of our bomb group, but I am in regular contact with the Bomb Group Association, which they have annual reunions, and I don't rush off to them. The people I was interested in primarily was my own crew, and I have seen a number of them from time to time over the years. On one particular occasion, this is probably, well, let's see, I retired in '92. This is probably 20 years ago plus. I was able to get 3 others of the survivors together with me, and we went to a place called Geneseo, New York, which is outside of Rochester, and we spent an hour flying in a B-17, which was great, which was terrific. I had both pilots, pilot and co-pilot, and this great ball turret gunner from Beverly, Mass, and Nicky Papa by name, Dominic J. Papa. And Nicky Papa and the two pilots and I spent an hour in a B-17. Interestingly enough, the ball turret gunner, after flying his last mission, which was the day after mine, never flew in an airplane again until the day we took him up in a 17 in Geneseo, and hasn't flown since. He says, I think I used up my luck.
Did your pilot and co-pilot fly that plane?
Fly that plane that day? Yes, both of them did. The pilot flew it for probably 15 or 20 minutes. The co-pilot had a stroke, but he was physically able but not able to communicate terribly well, outgoing. He could understand, but his attempt to verbalize were affected by the stroke that he'd had. But he flew it for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So both the pilots did fly it. I was even asked if I wanted to, but I did not.
You had given me a book that another man compiled based on your emails with him. Will you tell me how that came to be briefly?
Well, the other man whose name is Terence Jost, is the son of the bombardier which was on the crew of our airplane before we got our airplane. They were the previous flyers of that, and they completed their missions on WWII, which was the name of our plane. And through a series of coincidences, he got my name. He first of all got the name of my bombardier's youngest brother, the youngest brother of the bombardier who was killed, who lives also in Rochester, New York. And the brother of the bombardier forwarded the email from Jost to me. And that's how I got in touch with Jost. And I said, yes, I too was on WWII. His question first, was there more than one WWII? No, there was only one. But the fact that we had, and that our bombardier had been killed, but that's how we maintained contact. And then he started asking me questions on email.
How did your service and experiences during the war affect the rest of your life?
Probably for a while after the war, I told war stories along with the other guys who told war stories. When we went back to college in the fall, there were a lot of returning veterans at that point. So a lot of us had a sort of a common experience. There was a lot of chit-chat there, but I don't think it's affected the rest of my life that much. Outside of the fact, oh yes, the VA, I use the VA for medicine now. I go to a physician at the VA, I get my prescriptions from the VA, which is very good because they're a lot cheaper from the VA than they are from the drugstore. That is a distinct benefit. And I have a wonderful little Chinese lady doctor at the VA with whom I occasionally speak Chinese, which is sort of fun.
Is there anything else you would like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
No, I think that I'm very pleased to have my experiences, such as they were, as part of the overall record. I don't think there's anything else that we haven't covered. We lived an outlandish schedule from time to time because a lot of times we would be awakened at 2 in the morning to go to briefing and take off on a long mission very early in the morning, get back late in the afternoon. Sleep was a thing that you took when you could get it overseas. But as I said, I was extremely fortunate. I was overseas for a total of 7 months and 25 days. The requirement for separation when I was separated was 8 months overseas, but they considered anything over 15 days as the next higher month. So I skinned right through that, period. Interesting sidelight that I haven't told you was in the election of 1944, I wanted to vote in the presidential election. I wanted to get an absentee ballot. Then my mother and my legal residence was Montclair, New Jersey. So before I went overseas, I went to see the town clerk in Montclair, New Jersey, and I pointed out, I think you had to be of age by the 5th of November, which was election day. I was born on the 6th of November in Shanghai, China. However, Shanghai, China is 13 hours ahead of East Coast time in the United States. So I went and I pointed out to this town clerk, I said, hey, although my record shows that I was born on the 6th of November by East Coast time, I was born on the 5th. He says, oh, I'll send you a ballot. But he didn't. I never got one. Irrelevant story.
Is there anything else?
I can't think of anything else, Jane.
Well, thank you for this interview and thank you for your service.
Well, thank you very much for interviewing me. Appreciate it.